300 motorcycles spreading through the grid of downtown Marlow, Ohio at 4 in the afternoon was not something the city's traffic management system had a protocol for. The dispatchers watching the camera feeds saw them first, not as a gathering, not as a procession, but as a dispersal. They came in from the west side in groups of 2 and 3 and split at every intersection, filling the grid methodically, one block per pair working east. Anyone watching from above would have seen it as a pattern immediately. A search pattern, the kind used by people who know what they're doing when they're looking for something in a grid and they need to cover ground before the light goes. The light in Marlow, Ohio on the third Thursday of October went at 6:32. It was 4:07 when the first bikes entered the search grid. They had 2 hours and 25 minutes. It had all started at 2:48 that afternoon when a 79-year-old woman named Evelyn Park had stepped out of a taxi on the corner of Merchant and 14th Street, which was not the corner she had asked for, and the taxi had pulled away before she had fully oriented herself, and the street around her had offered none of the sounds she had been listening for since 1994, when she had lost her sight and had begun the patient and methodical work of learning to move through the world without it. The Marlow Taxi Company's dispatch records would later show that driver 44, a man named Gerald Besh, had been 9 minutes from Evelyn Park's requested destination, the Marlow Music Conservatory on Fenwick Street, when he received a second call for a fare across town. The records would show the route deviation. The records would show the time of drop-off. What the records would not show, but what the dashcam footage would, was the moment Gerald Besh had looked in his mirror at the small woman in the back seat with the white cane folded on her lap, and calculated, and pulled over, and opened the door from the front, and said, "This is your stop," while she was still finding her bearings. He had driven away before she reached the sidewalk. He had not looked back. He had told himself it was close enough, which was the thing people told themselves when they decided someone else's inconvenience was less important than their own. And he had taken the crosstown fare and been $5 richer by 3:15. And he had not thought about the corner of Merchant and 14th again until his phone rang at 6:30 that evening. And it was his dispatcher, and his dispatcher's voice was a specific kind of flat that Gerald Besh would not forget. If you're new here, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see where this reaches. Because what happened between 2:48 and 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in October, and how a woman named Evelyn Park spent those 72 minutes, is something you need to hear before you hear what 300 people did about it. Stay with me. Her name was Evelyn Sunyi Park, and she was 79 years old, and she had been teaching piano for 51 years. She had been born in Seoul and come to Ohio at 23 with a music degree from Ewha Women's University and an acceptance to the graduate program at the Cleveland Institute of Music. And she had been in Ohio ever since, which was 56 years, which was long enough that she thought in English but counted in Korean, and dreamed in both. She had married a man named Robert Park, who had been an engineer and a terrible but enthusiastic tennis player, and who had died in 2011. And she had continued teaching because teaching was what she did and stopping was not something she had considered. She taught out of the Marlow Music Conservatory on Fenwick Street 2 afternoons a week and had done so for 11 years. She had 12 students ranging in age from 7 to 63, and she was demanding in the specific way of a teacher who knows that the instrument deserves more than the student currently gives it and intends to extract the more. She had produced 4 students who had gone on to professional careers, which she mentioned rarely and thought about often. She had lost her sight in stages between 1991 and 1994, the same degenerative process that had taken Eunice Paces, and she had responded to it the way she responded to most things, with a period of private grief that she did not perform for anyone, and a subsequent reorganization of her approach that was systematic and complete. She learned to navigate by sound and touch and air pressure, and the specific signatures of familiar spaces. She learned the conservatory as a set of distances and surfaces. She learned the taxi route as a sequence of sounds and smells. The turn at the signal at Delancey that made a 2-tone beep. The smell of the Korean bakery on Fenwick that meant she was 3 blocks from the conservatory. The particular texture of the sidewalk outside the conservatory entrance that she recognized under her cane before she heard the building. She had taken the same taxi with the same company every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years. She did not know driver 44. She had her usual driver on Tuesdays and a backup she recognized on most Thursdays. Today she had been assigned someone new, which happened occasionally, and she had given him the address clearly. Marlowe Music Conservatory, 441 Fenwick Street, and she had settled in and begun listening for her landmarks. The signal at Delancey did not sound. The bakery smell on Fenwick did not come. The street sounds were wrong. Not completely wrong, not the sounds of a neighborhood she'd never been near, but specifically wrong in the way of sounds that should be familiar and aren't. The particular echo off buildings that weren't the right height, the traffic rhythm from a direction it shouldn't be coming from. She had been registering these discrepancies for 4 blocks before the door opened, and the driver said, "This is your stop." She had said, "I don't think this is." The taxi had gone. She stood on the sidewalk with her cane out, and she listened. She heard construction, which was wrong. There was no construction on Fenwick. She heard a bus line she didn't recognize by its engine note. She heard the wind moving differently than it should, which meant the buildings were different heights and placed differently than she had expected. She was not where she was supposed to be. She was not panicking. Panic was not useful. She had known since 1994 that panic was not useful, and she had trained herself away from it in the years since with the same discipline she brought to her students when they hit a passage that frightened them. The passage is not the enemy. Stop. Listen. Begin again. She stopped. She listened. She began to work the problem. Her granddaughter's name was Amy, and she was 26 years old, and she had been calling Evelyn's phone since 3:15 when the conservatory had called Amy's number, on file as the emergency contact, to say that Mrs. Park had not arrived for her 3 o'clock lesson, which she had never missed in 11 years. Amy had called the phone 4 times. It had rung and gone to voicemail, which meant the phone was on and nearby and not being answered, which meant Evelyn could not hear it in the ambient noise of wherever she was, or could not find it in her bag, or was otherwise occupied in a way that prevented answering. At 3:40, Amy had called the taxi company. The dispatcher had reached driver 44, who had said he dropped her on Fenwick as requested. The dispatcher had noted this in the log. The log was wrong. At 3:50, Amy had called the police non-emergency line. She had been told to wait 48 hours before filing a missing persons report. She had said her grandmother was blind and elderly, and had not arrived at her destination and was not answering her phone. She had been told someone would do a welfare check in the area. At 4:01, Amy had called a man named James Song, who was 38 years old and had been a family friend since before Amy was born, and who was, among other things, a member of the Ohio chapter who had ridden with Robert Park in the early 2000s, before Robert's knees had made riding impractical. Amy had said 3 sentences. James had said, "What area did the taxi drop her?" Amy had said everything she knew. James had said, "I'll call you back." He had called 6 people. Those 6 had called 6 more. By 4:07, the first bikes were in the grid. The search pattern had been James's design, sketched on the back of a parts receipt while he was on the phone, based on where the taxi had plausibly deviated from the route and what grid area was reachable on foot from those deviation points. He had divided the grid into blocks and assigned pairs to each block and communicated the assignments by a voice message sent to a group thread that grew from 6 to 90 to 300 in the time it took him to ride from his shop to the western edge of the search area. What the search looked like from the street was this: 2 motorcycles moving slowly down each block, engines low, riders with helmets off so they could hear, calling into alleyways and storefronts, asking people on sidewalks if they'd seen a small woman with a white cane. People gave answers. Some hadn't seen anything. Some had. A woman who thought she'd seen someone near the library on 12th, a man who remembered a woman asking him directions 20 minutes ago near the construction on Whitmore. These fragments went into the group thread, and James mapped them in his head as he rode, triangulating, narrowing. He rode the central corridor himself. He was listening as he rode, not for Evelyn specifically, because he did not know what she sounded like or what she would do when lost, but for anything that did not belong to the grid. A voice, a cane on pavement, a sound out of place. The sun was at the angle that turned west-facing windows orange. It was 4:22. Evelyn had been working the problem for 94 minutes. She had moved systematically, 3 blocks south, listening, trying to triangulate the bus sound and the construction sound and the wind against the buildings until she had a rough sense of where she might be. She had asked 2 people for directions in that time. The first had not understood her and had hurried on. The second had told her Fenwick was 6 blocks north, which was helpful. Except that in moving north, she had encountered the construction barrier, a temporary plywood wall stretching most of a block, and had followed it and lost her reckoning again. She was on a block she did not know. She had one hand on the construction barrier, and she was counting her steps back the way she had come. And she was humming. Not distress humming. Not the sound of someone at the edge of their composure. She was humming a Chopin nocturne, the one in E-flat, Op. 9, number 2, because she had been teaching it to a student that afternoon, and it was in her hands and her mind, and humming it was a way of being somewhere she knew, while her body was somewhere she didn't. She hummed it at tempo, the full melodic line, the ornaments in the right places, with the measured control of a woman who has been hearing music exactly as she intends it for 51 years. She was not lost. She was delayed. She told herself, "You have navigated worse than this. You navigated the first year. You navigated the conservatory with its confusing acoustic lobby. You navigated Robert's death. You can navigate 6 blocks north on a Thursday afternoon." She kept humming. She kept her hand on the barrier. She kept counting. James Song heard it from half a block away. He had turned onto the block at 4:48, moving slowly, listening, and the sound came to him on the westerly wind. A melody, clean and precisely articulated, coming from the middle of the block, near the construction barrier. He stopped the bike. He listened. Chopin. He was not a man who knew much about classical music, but he knew this piece because Amy had played it once at a family gathering, badly, and Evelyn had corrected her with 3 words that had been both kind and absolute, and Amy had played it again, and the difference had been significant. He pulled the bike to the curb and got off and left it and walked toward the sound. She was standing with her right hand on the plywood barrier, facing south, her white cane extended, counting something under her breath between the phrases of the nocturne. He said, "Mrs. Park." She stopped humming. She turned her head in the precise way of someone who locates sound before they respond to it. She said, "Yes." He said, "My name is James Song. I rode with Robert. I'm Amy's friend." He paused. "We've been looking for you." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "For how long?" He said, "About 45 minutes." She said, "About 300. A pause. She said, "That seems like a great deal of people for 6 blocks. He said, "We covered more than 6 blocks. She said, "I moved around. I was trying to work out where I was." "You were very systematic about it." She said, "How would you know that?" He said, "Because we had to cover a lot of ground before we found you." Away from the focused calm she had been maintaining for 94 minutes, towards something else. Not relief exactly. The adjacent thing. The place where a person arrives when they have been holding something heavy and someone else's hands come under it. She said, "The taxi driver." James said, "He knew I couldn't see." James said, "I know." She said, "He made a calculation." James said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Her hand was still on the plywood barrier. The Chopin had stopped. She said, "I want to get to my lesson. I'm late." James said, "It's nearly 5 o'clock." She said, "My 3 o'clock student will have gone home, but I have a 4:30. He said, "The conservatory knows you're all right. They've been notified." She said, "Then they'll know I'm coming." She lifted her cane from the ground and adjusted the angle of it. 6 blocks north, is that right?" He said, 6 blocks. She said, "Will you walk with me?" He said, "Not in front, beside." He said, "Understood." He sent the message to the group thread at 4:53. Found her 6 blocks north on Whitmore at the Hargrove construction site. She's fine. She's walking to her lesson. The replies came back in a stream he did not read while he was walking, because he was walking with Evelyn Park along the grid of downtown Marlow toward Fenwick Street, and he was paying attention to the pace she set and the things she listened for and the particular authority with, which she moved through a city she could not see. She asked him about Robert. She asked what they had ridden together and when, and whether James had been at the memorial ride in 2012, which James had been, and they talked about Robert the way people talk about the dead they have in common, with the ease of people who have already done the grief and are now in the territory of memory, which is different and more comfortable. She said he never told me much about the chapter. James said he was private about it, in a good way. James said, the road does that. She said, he said it was the only place where he could think without being interrupted. James said, I used to think that was what music was for me. He said, what is it now? But I understand the road better now. They walked. The bakery smell on Fenwick reached her at half a block away, and she slowed for a fraction of a second. Not from uncertainty, from recognition. The smell she had been listening for, the landmark that told her she was 3 blocks from the conservatory. She did not say anything about it. She just walked forward, slightly easier in her step, toward the place she knew. Gerald Besch's taxi medallion was suspended within 48 hours. The dashcam footage, which the Marlowe Taxi Company had been asked for by the police, following a formal complaint filed by Amy Park with the assistance of a lawyer who had been contacted by James Song at 5:15 on Thursday afternoon, showed the corner of Merchant and 14th, and it showed the fare window that showed the distance remaining to the stated destination, and it showed the rearview mirror. And what the rearview mirror showed was not reviewed by anyone except the police investigator and the lawyer and the taxi company's liability counsel. But the outcome of the review was the suspension and a civil complaint filed on Evelyn's behalf, that the liability counsel had recommended settling quickly. The Marlowe Taxi Company also updated its driver training protocols, specifically the section covering passengers with disabilities, specifically the section that had previously consisted of 1 sentence and had been expanded at the City Licensing Board's requirement to 4 pages. Amy drove her grandmother to the conservatory every Tuesday and Thursday for the 6 weeks following the Thursday in October. It was not a long drive. Amy did not mind it. On the 7th Thursday, Evelyn said at breakfast that she was going to take a taxi. Amy said, Grandma, Evelyn said, I have been taking taxis to that conservatory for 6 years, and I am not going to stop because one man made a bad decision. The decision was his. The route is mine. Amy looked at her. She said, will you call me when you get there? Evelyn said, I call you when I get there every time. She took the taxi. She gave the address clearly, Marlowe Music Conservatory, 441 Fenwick Street, and she settled in and she listened for her landmarks. The signal at Delancey, the bakery smell on Fenwick. 3 blocks from the conservatory, she heard something she had not heard on this route before. A motorcycle, half a block behind the taxi, keeping pace. She did not turn her head. There was nothing to turn her head toward, but she listened to the engine, not the make, which she didn't know, but the note of it, even, unhurried, following the same turns the taxi made, at the same pace, as if the city around them were a piece of music and the engine were keeping time. She smiled. She did not say anything to the driver. 3 blocks later, the taxi stopped at the conservatory entrance, and she got out and the motorcycle's engine idled behind her for a moment. And then, when she reached the conservatory door and pushed it open and went in, the engine note moved away down Fenwick, smooth and even, already going somewhere else. She went to her studio. She began. Some people decide that another person's difficulty is not worth 4 extra blocks. They make the calculation and they make the turn and they drive away and they tell themselves it was close enough. It is not close enough. Close enough is for people who cannot hear the difference between the note that is right and the note that is almost right. For people who have never sat beside a student and said, again, the passage deserves more than almost. 300 people know the difference. If this story reached you, if you believe that every person who cannot see still deserves to arrive where they are going, share it tonight. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. Drop your city in the comments. And if you know someone who moves through the world with more courage and competence than the people around them ever give them credit for, type Fenwick Street in the comments. I read every single one.